I've been a park ranger for more than 20 years. During that time, I've come to love the quiet beauty of the forests, the call of the birds in the morning, and the rustling of the leaves at dusk. But, along with the usual wildlife and stunning views, I've seen things that can't be easily explained. Over the years, I've had several encounters with creatures that don't belong to the usual list of animals found in these woods. Some call them cryptids, strange, unknown animals that are talked about in whispers and stories. I don't know what to call them, but I know what I saw. The first time I saw something strange was early in my career. I was on a late-night patrol, driving slowly down a narrow dirt road in one of the more remote sections of the park. The headlights barely pierced the dense fog that had settled in. I came around a bend, and there, standing in the middle of the road, was something I'll never forget. It stood upright like a man, but it was covered in fur. Its eyes reflected in the headlights, glowing a deep amber. I stopped the truck and just stared, unsure of what to do. After a few seconds, it stepped off the road and disappeared into the trees without making a sound. I sat there for what felt like hours before I finally worked up the nerve to keep going. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. Years later, I saw something else that made me question everything I thought I knew about the forest. It was summer, and the park was busy with hikers and campers. One night, I was checking a campsite near a river when I heard a strange noise coming from the water. It was a low humming sound, almost like a deep growl, but there was a rhythm to it, like a song. I shined my flashlight towards the riverbank, expecting to see a bear or some other large animal, but what I saw wasn't like anything I'd ever encountered. There, half submerged in the water, was a creature that looked almost like a large seal, but its body was much longer, and its skin was smooth, almost like that of a dolphin. It had a long neck and a face that reminded me of a snake, with small, dark eyes. It looked at me for a moment before it sank into the water without a splash, and I never saw it again. I remember standing there, flashlight still pointed at the river, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But the sound it made, the hum, stayed with me. I couldn't forget it. Not long after that, I started hearing reports from hikers about strange lights in the sky. Most of the time, I chalked it up to drones or maybe some kind of military exercise, but one night, I saw them myself. I was on a fire watch, stationed on a ridge overlooking the park. It was a clear night, no clouds in sight, and I could see for miles. Around midnight, I noticed 3 lights hovering in the sky. They weren't planes or helicopters. There was no sound, and they moved in ways that didn't make sense. They zigzagged, shot straight up, and then came to a dead stop. I watched them for about 10 minutes before they disappeared all at once. I've seen plenty of aircraft during my time in the park, but nothing like that. Then, there was the incident with the giant bird. I was hiking deep into the backcountry, checking for signs of illegal campsites. I'd heard stories from locals about a massive bird that lived in the area, but I'd never given them much thought. That changed one afternoon when I heard a loud whooshing sound overhead. I looked up and saw a shadow pass over me. It was huge, bigger than any eagle or hawk I'd ever seen. The wingspan must have been over 10 feet. I only caught a glimpse of it before it vanished behind the treetops, but it was enough. Its body was dark, almost black, and its wings were wide and powerful. I never saw it land, but the stories I'd heard suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. There was also the time I came across strange tracks in the snow. It was winter, and I was on a routine patrol after a fresh snowfall. I spotted the tracks leading from the forest to a frozen lake. They were large and had a strange shape, almost like a mix between a bear's paw and a human foot, but with longer claws. I followed the tracks for a while, but they ended suddenly near the edge of the lake. There were no signs of the creature turning around or heading back into the trees, almost as if it had simply vanished. I took pictures and sent them to a wildlife expert, but no one could identify what had made them. Perhaps the strangest thing I've seen happened about 5 years ago. I was on a multi-day patrol, hiking to some of the more remote parts of the park. One evening, I set up camp near a meadow and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. As night fell, I started hearing a sound I can only describe as chittering, like a group of animals communicating with each other. I figured it was some small critters nearby, so I didn't pay much attention at first. But then the sound got closer, louder, and I realized it wasn't coming from any direction I could pinpoint. It was as if the sound was all around me. I stood up, shined my flashlight into the darkness, and saw something moving just at the edge of the light. I couldn't make out its shape, but it was large. The chittering grew louder, and whatever it was moved away, disappearing into the night. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what I've seen. Maybe some of these creatures are just undiscovered species, animals that have managed to stay hidden from human eyes. Or maybe there's something else, something that we're not meant to understand. I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure I want them. All I know is that the forest is a place full of mysteries, and even after all these years, it still finds ways to surprise me. I've learned to respect it and to accept that some things are just beyond explanation. I was driving to the Grand Canyon, choosing the scenic route through the vast Arizona desert. It's a quieter drive than the busier highways, with fewer cars on the road and slower speed limits. The peaceful open road seemed perfect for a long trip, giving us the chance to enjoy the scenery without the stress of heavy traffic. I drive a big SUV, which is perfect for these family trips, so I packed up everything we needed for the journey, loaded the kids and my spouse into the car, and set off just before sunrise. The city was almost entirely empty at that early hour. The streets, normally bustling with people and cars, were deserted. It felt a bit strange, but also peaceful to see the city so still. There were no honking horns, no crowded intersections, just the quiet hum of our car as it rolled through the sleeping city. The early morning air was cool, a welcome contrast to the usual heat of Arizona. I cracked the window open slightly, letting the fresh air in as we drove. It was nice to enjoy the stillness, to be on the road without the usual stress of navigating through heavy traffic or dealing with road construction. My spouse and the kids quickly fell asleep once we got on the highway. The kids were out before we even left the driveway, and my spouse drifted off not long after we passed a security checkpoint on the edge of the city. Luckily, we didn't get stopped for inspection. I've heard stories of random checks, and I knew that if we had been selected, it would have scared the kids. But we sailed through without any issues. An hour into the drive, I stopped at a small roadside diner to grab some coffee. It was a little place off the highway, a bit old-fashioned with a neon sign buzzing in the early light. I ordered a cup of coffee, and while waiting, I noticed how quiet the highway was. Only a few cars passed by, and there were even fewer parked at the diner. The drive had been smooth so far, and the nearly empty roads were a relief. I've never been a fan of driving, especially on long trips. It's not the distance that bothers me, it's the traffic. I hate sitting in congestion, starting and stopping every few minutes, surrounded by honking horns and impatient drivers. But this trip had been calm, and I was grateful for it. After getting my coffee, I jumped back on the highway. The stretch of road ahead was long and empty, the desert on either side stretching as far as the eye could see. The open road was peaceful, the sky gradually lightening as the sun began to rise. The soft pink and orange hues of dawn painted the horizon, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me as I drove. This was the kind of drive I enjoyed. Quiet, with nothing but the wide open landscape and the distant hum of the car. As peaceful as it was, I knew I had to stay alert. Long, empty roads like these can lull you into a false sense of security, and I've heard plenty of warnings about sleepy drivers and truckers. Some sections of the highway had very little lighting, especially between the small desert towns, which made it even more important to stay focused. The darkness and the lack of other cars gave the road a lonely, almost eerie feeling, but the steady sips of coffee kept me awake. We made our first rest stop after about an hour. The kids were still fast asleep in the back, undisturbed by the stop. My spouse and I took turns using the bathroom while the others stayed with the car. After all the coffee, I was more than ready for a break. The rest stop was mostly empty, with only a couple of trucks parked under the dim lights. I took a few minutes to walk around, stretching my legs after sitting for so long. The air was still cool, but there was a hint of the heat that would come later in the day. It was the calm before the scorching desert sun took over. The rest stop felt oddly quiet, almost too quiet. There were only a few other travelers, an older couple and a family with kids. The parking lot was brightly lit, a beacon in the otherwise dark desert. As I walked around, I couldn't help but notice how isolated we were. Rest stops like this are often portrayed in stories as places where strange things happen, but I shrugged off the feeling. After a quick stretch, I got back into the car and we hit the road again. The next stretch of the drive was more of the same, endless desert and barren highway. There wasn't much to see, just the vast, empty landscape on either side. The road stretched out in front of me, a straight line cutting through the desert. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows across the sand. It was peaceful, in a way. The kind of peace you can only find in the middle of nowhere, where the only sound is the quiet hum of your car and the wind whistling through the open windows. About 30 minutes after leaving the rest stop, something strange happened. I was driving along, half lost in my thoughts, when suddenly a dark shape darted across the road. I barely had time to react before I hit it. My heart jumped in my chest as I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to process what had happened. My spouse stirred awake, asking what was going on. I told them I thought I hit something, but I wasn't sure what. I looked in the rearview mirror, but it was still too dark to see anything clearly. There weren't any streetlights, and the only light came from the dim glow of the car's taillights. Curious, I got out of the car, grabbing my phone to use as a flashlight. I stood by the side of the road for a moment, listening to the silence. There was no sound, no movement, just the quiet desert stretching out in every direction. I started walking slowly toward the spot where I thought I hit something. As I got closer to the side of the road, I saw something lying in the grass. It looked like a crumpled bag, pale and lifeless. I walked closer, shining the light on it, and just as I was about to reach down, the thing moved. I froze. My heart raced as I watched the pale object shift, then suddenly shoot up and scurry off into the darkness. It moved fast, darting on all fours toward a group of trees on the edge of the road. I stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The pale skin, the way it moved, it didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen before. I caught a glimpse of its face, just for a second. It had large, dark eyes that seemed too big for its head, and its pale skin glistened in the light. I thought about following it, but something held me back. The kids and my spouse were still in the car, and the last thing I wanted was to leave them alone on this dark, empty road. I stood there for a few more seconds, my flashlight sweeping over the trees where the thing had disappeared, but I couldn't see anything. The desert was silent again, as if nothing had happened. One day, I went to the Tallgrass Prairie, a vast, rolling grassland near Wichita, Kansas. It's a place I always go when I need to think, find inspiration, or just be alone. The open fields and endless stretches of grass are calming, and it always feels like the land has a story to tell. On this particular day, the air felt different, heavy with anticipation, as if something was about to happen. The sky wasn't threatening rain, but there was a certain weight to the atmosphere. I had my notebook with me, like I always do. As a writer, I find that the prairie often sparks new ideas for stories, so I'm always ready to capture the feeling of the land. I started walking along one of the trails, enjoying the peacefulness, but soon I began to feel a little uneasy. Not scared, but aware, as if something or someone else was there with me. I looked around, but the prairie seemed empty. Still, that strange feeling lingered. I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. An active imagination is something that comes naturally to a writer like me. But then I heard something strange. It was soft, almost too faint to notice at first. Whispers. Gentle voices carried on the breeze, as if the grass itself was trying to tell me something. I stopped, listening closely, unsure of what I was hearing. The sound seemed to be coming from a patch of grass that moved differently than the rest, swaying even though there was no wind. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked toward it. In the middle of this clearing, surrounded by tall grasses and wildflowers, I saw something I could hardly believe. Standing there, in the heart of the prairie, was a creature like nothing I'd ever seen. It seemed to be made from the earth itself, its body covered in grass, leaves, and flowers. It was tall, graceful, and its skin shimmered in the sunlight, blending perfectly with the landscape. The creature looked at me with eyes that were deep and ancient, as if it had lived for centuries and knew the secrets of the land. I felt in that moment that this creature wasn't just part of the prairie, but its guardian, watching over the land and all the life that depended on it. The whispers I had heard earlier were coming from it, like the voice of the earth speaking in a language only the heart could understand. I was completely mesmerized. Everything about this creature felt magical, but not in a fairy tale kind of way. It was the magic of nature itself, the kind you don't see but feel in your bones when you're connected to something larger than yourself. I wanted to reach out, to touch it, to make sure it was real, but as I moved closer, the creature stepped back. It didn't run or vanish. It just slowly blended back into the prairie, disappearing among the grasses and wild flowers, as if it had never been there. The whispers stopped, and the world around me returned to normal, but I was left standing in awe, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I don't know how long I stood there, thinking about the creature, about the eyes that seemed to know everything. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had encountered something ancient and wise, something that had always been there, watching and waiting, hidden in the whispers of the wind and the rustling grass. When I finally left, I had a story inside me, one I knew I had to write down. It wasn't something I imagined, it was real. The land had shown me one of its secrets, and it felt like a gift, a reminder that the world is full of wonders we can't always explain. The magic of that moment wasn't the kind found in books about wizards or spells. It was the magic of connection between people, the land, and the ancient rhythms of nature. Even now, I think about that day and wonder what else is hidden in the tall grasses of the Kansas prairie, waiting to be discovered. There's a mystery there. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whispers too. My name is Sean, and I work as a security guard. I've been here for nearly 5 years, and my shifts rotate between days, nights, and weekends. It's a busy place, so there's rarely a dull moment. A couple of weeks ago, I was on the night shift, doing my rounds near the emergency department. We had a few patients come in earlier, but by around 2 a.m., things were quiet. I was standing outside, enjoying some fresh air when my radio crackled to life. One of the other guards mentioned that the hospital helicopter was landing. Now, we only use that helicopter for critical cases, maybe a few times a month. I didn't think much of it at first, but then it lifted off again just 10 minutes later, heading back out. I figured there must have been a major accident somewhere, so I went back inside, expecting the ER to be flooded with patients, but it wasn't. Over the next hour, the helicopter returned 2 more times. I started feeling uneasy. We rarely see multiple trips in such a short window, especially without anyone sounding the alarm for help. No ambulances, no code calls, nothing. I was getting curious, so I wandered over to the top floor where the helipad is located. We have this private access point only hospital staff with clearance can use. As I reached the landing area, I expected to see some activity, nurses, doctors, maybe even another guard, but there was no one around. It felt wrong. Then I heard voices, muffled, but frantic. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was clear something serious was happening behind those walls. I thought maybe I could spot someone coming in through one of the restricted doors, but it stayed eerily quiet. Suddenly, I felt strange. This wave of nausea hit me, and I started getting flashes in my head, like vivid memories of being in a hospital bed. I could feel the cold steel beneath me, the pinch of needles in my arms, unfamiliar doctors surrounding me, but I knew none of it was real. At least, I think I did. As I snapped out of it, I heard a commotion. Loud voices, equipment being knocked over, someone shouting for restraints. I rushed to the security room where we monitor everything, hoping to catch something on the cameras. I saw the medical team speeding down one of the hallways, pushing a gurney covered with blood-soaked sheets. They disappeared behind one of the restricted doors, but just before the door closed, I glimpsed a hand, pale and gray, hanging off the edge of the bed. I couldn't access that part of the building without a clearance card, so I stood there frozen. My partner showed up a few minutes later, and I told him what I'd seen. He looked skeptical, but I could tell something was off. Now, every night I'm on shift, I keep an eye on that helipad and those restricted doors. I don't know what they're transporting in and out of there, but I'm determined to find out. Whatever's going on, it's being kept quiet, and I've got a bad feeling about it. I'm hoping to catch another glimpse next time. Maybe then I'll figure out what they're hiding. It all started on a rainy afternoon. The wind howled outside as Claire sat in the living room, waiting for her parents to come home. They had gone on a trip for a couple of days, leaving her alone in the house for the first time. At first, she was excited about having the place to herself, but now, as the sky darkened and the rain came down harder, she felt a little uneasy. The house was quiet. Claire tried to distract herself by watching TV, but her mind kept wandering. Every creak in the floor, every rustle outside made her jump. She decided to make herself some tea to calm her nerves. As she walked into the kitchen, she froze. There, on the counter, was a small piece of paper. It wasn't there before. Claire's heart pounded as she picked it up. The note read, "Don't go upstairs." Her hands trembled. Who had left this? She was sure no one else was in the house. She checked the doors. They were locked, just as she had left them. Trying to convince herself it was a prank or something she had missed, Claire crumpled up the note and tossed it in the trash. But then, curiosity got the better of her. Why shouldn't I go upstairs? She thought. She hesitated, staring at the staircase, but finally decided to ignore the warning. After all, it was her house. She climbed the stairs, feeling the old wood creak beneath her feet. When she reached the top, her bedroom door was slightly open. Claire walked inside cautiously. Sitting on her bed was another note. This one said, "I warned you." She turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the hallway was empty. She rushed to the window and looked outside. The rain was still pouring, and the street was deserted. She backed away from the window. Claire didn't know what to do. She locked her bedroom door and sat on the floor, hugging her knees. Her phone was on the bedside table, but when she grabbed it, the screen was black. It wouldn't turn on. Suddenly, there was a knock. Not on the door, but on the wall, right next to her. Claire gasped, backing away. The knocking was soft, but steady. And then she saw it. Another note slipped under her door, as if someone was right outside. With shaking hands, Claire picked it up. The note said, "You should have listened." She scrambled to the door, unlocked it, and threw it open. No one was there. The hallway was empty, just like before. The air felt colder now, and Claire could hear the sound of whispering, faint and far away. Suddenly the lights flickered, and the whispers grew louder. Claire bolted down the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps. She had to get out of the house now. But when she reached the front door, there was one last note taped to it. It said, "It's too late.